So I'm delighted to be able to welcome Professor John Barrett. John is Professor of Energy and Climate Policy in the Sustainability Research Institute at the University of Leeds. And amongst others, John's research interests include energy demand, resource productivity, energy and economy modelling, and carbon accounting. And this afternoon, he's going to talk to us about the use of multi-regional input-output modelling in the measurement of material consumption across different scales within the context of circular economy. So welcome, John. And are you happy to share your slides? Thank you.
Great. I hope you can, is that clear, Fiona?
That's fine. Yep, can see those.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you for the introduction. So I will just add a couple of other points as well. So we are currently responsible for providing DEFRA and Office of National Statistics with the material flow accounts for the UK, and have also been supporting the Scottish Government. And I'll take you through some of the examples, but we've also then provided the Climate Change Committee with lots of their modelling on resource efficiency for the 6th Carbon Budget Report, and also been working closely with DEFRA to understand how we can move from this top-level modelling into specific policies to improve resource productivity in the UK. So I'll sort of take you through that journey today in a very short amount of time, and obviously looking forward to your questions as well. So national accounts, I suppose, is a broader term than just material flows, and usually national accounts refer to sort of a framework that brings units and sort of transactions together to provide a simple and understandable description of production and consumption and how those two link together. It predominantly then refers to like financial transactions, and every country has a set of national accounts. But more and more, this is extended beyond this economic analysis to provide a more complete national picture of environmental pressures, such as material flows and also greenhouse gas emissions. What's interesting about, I suppose, the national accounts is that they take into account the trade that we have with other countries. So in essence, they will consider, let's say, the economic success of the country based on what we export elsewhere and what we import from others, as well as our own domestic production. Following this same philosophy through then to environmental pressures suggests that we should also not just think about the emission reduction that would happen in UK industry and households, for example, but the effect that we could have outside the UK by changing the way that we use resources or the way that we consume. And so therefore, often we find that these material flow accounts take what might be described as a consumption perspective. And this, in essence, gives us a complete picture of the material requirements to provide us with all our consumption in the UK, irrespective of whether it's produced. So to do this, we use global models to understand the flow of materials in trade, as well as having a detailed understanding of what's happening inside the UK. And this allows us, as you see in this chart here, at that very top level, to understand the material flows associated with a range of key materials at that quite high level. Now, while this gives us a sense of general direction, it is very aggregated and very limited in terms of its application. So I'm going to guide you through how, in essence, we go from this top level figure to something which has real application in a policy context, and then also where this approach falls short and what needs to be done to try and link up what's happening at a company level, be them looking at the whole company or an individual product within their company, with the whole national accounts, which is being used to help guide policy. So as well as material flows, we also look at greenhouse gas emissions as well. And here, in essence, shows our reliance on the imports of products, really materials which have an embodied energy attached to them, the energy required in their production supply chain, and how they link to UK consumption. So just looking at emissions for a second, the territorial emissions that happen inside the UK, around 473 million. But then when we add on all of the other elements, bunker fuels and other such things, we get the UK production emissions at 576 million that you'll see in the middle of the chart. The UK is heavily reliant on imports, And here you can see that the emissions embodied in import for the UK is 364 million. We clearly export some of our products, which also obviously required energy and emissions. And if we take those off, we end up with the UK's consumption-based emissions at around 800 million tonnes. So nearly half of our emissions are embodied in our imports. And it's the multi-regional input-output models that allow us to do this by tracking the flow of emissions through sectors and countries, as well as I said, an understanding of our detailed understanding of our domestic production. I'm going to quickly guide you through that with the use of energy, but this could just as relevant be materials or emissions. If we start by looking at this chart here, on the left-hand side of the chart, I never know if you can see my where I'm pointing to on this, but hopefully you can see the UK production energy, and that's the amount of energy which is used by those different sectors in the UK, be it domestic heating, industry, transport, services, etc. We then understand in the middle which industries purchase the energy in the making of manufacturing in their products, and then we see how they're consumed by households or government and for what purpose. Now, this is clearly not the complete picture. We need to take into account imports into industry. So if we're thinking of a car, this might be particular components, or it might be steel or other materials used in the manufacturing or required to manufacture that product. But again, this isn't the full picture, because we also import finished products, which go straight to consumers. So that would be a car as a finished product imported, as opposed to particular components being imported by the car manufacturing sector. And added to that, then we also have this detailed understanding of which sectors are exporting. Now, you might think that I haven't overly simplified it here, but I promise you I have. This represents, we have this level of detail for 30 years over 106 different products. So this is broken down, or could be broken down, into thousands of different items. But it gives us a detailed picture of how the national picture can, in essence, break down into individual sectors and individual products, and how households are using those particular materials. Looking at that aggregate level, again, what's really important about these national accounting frameworks and our understanding of material flows is not just what I started with, the materials, but also where they come from and the origin of those materials. And this allows us to also look at production efficiency and changes in imports, as well as domestic production. And we start to build up a detailed picture of international supply chains and how all those countries import and the embodied emissions associated with them, and how this varies across different product groups. So it's not too surprising that most of the emissions associated with our use of electricity and gas originate or happen inside the UK. And the red bar on the chart on the right shows that. The same for our transport emissions and other such commodities. But on the other side, we have materials which are heavily imported, where up 95% of the emissions are happening outside the UK. And these are things like electrical goods, clothing, footwear, furniture, and so on and so on. In reality, this leads us to devise different strategies on how we can reduce the impacts and thinking about the circularity of these individual products. So one thing that's useful about these national accounting frameworks as well is they are designed in a way which link well with models which can project forward our future impacts. And we've developed our own modelling structure which allows us to project forwards the UK's material flows and also subsequent greenhouse gas emissions over time. So while this is a static accounting model that you're seeing here, projecting forward and having an understanding of what may happen under certain conditions is also extremely useful. And here I show you the result of one of our model outputs, which is projected forward our emissions based on up to 2050, based on current known policies in the UK. So we would suggest that under current known policies, and that excludes pledges. It means policies which have been identified and are carrying out, are happening. The UK's territorial emissions are going to be around 390 million tonnes. We will have even more emissions outside the UK, embodied in materials and products, to satisfy our consumption. And here is one of those scenarios which shows that. We can organise these emissions by industry types or by products. And this gives us certain flexibility to, in essence, understand where reduction is possible. We also have done a piece of work for DEFRA that we finished recently, which was to develop with a group of experts a range of scenarios based on a whole range of different contexts and different narratives for the future. What would happen if the UK has a stronger, more manufacturing base? What would happen if we make it even further shift towards services? What would happen if we, in essence, worked heavily on reducing the impact of the construction sector, but at the same time put the infrastructure in place that we need for the transition? What would a resource efficient future look like? And DEFRA are using this to help set their targets around future resource productivity. Just a couple of slides to go, and I wanted you to show that we've also been using this in a way to look at a whole range of resource efficiency strategies. We could define resource efficiency in a number of different ways. For me, it's about affecting both the efficiency of production, but also patterns of consumption. And here in this diagram, we can see from a production perspective, that's the emission reduction inside the UK. And on the consumption perspective, the emissions that happen outside the UK. You'll notice actually that the scale is different, because obviously there's more emission reduction happening outside the UK with lots of these policy areas. Putting aside the food one for now, but happy to answer questions later, we demonstrate a whole range of product longevity strategies to use products longer, to use them for their intended and technological lifetime, a whole range of policies around shifts from goods to services, to lightweighting of products, to circular use of products in industry, through to substituting to different materials and calculate them. This is then being used by DEFRA to see how we can translate these more broader strategies into individual policies to help bring about that change. I wanted to also highlight the value of having these national accounting structures on material flows. Means that we can carry out detailed understanding of how to reduce these material flows for the range of types of strategies that I've just mentioned, but also build that into other modelling frameworks. So this figure is part of a large project from CREDS, who I realise I didn't mention, so I'm a co-director of, which is the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, funded by UKRI. And here we're able to integrate all those findings on resource efficiencies, but integrate them with the possibilities for reduction in a whole range of different sectors, so we can get a sense of its overall contribution to, let's say, the net zero challenge. So what are the limitations of all these approaches? Well, we have this big national picture, but at the same time, we have companies trying to work out their individual impacts, trying to assess the impacts of individual products and come up with strategies to reduce the impacts at all stages along the supply chain, as well as changing their own efficiency inside their company. Those metrics, those approaches often are completely disconnected from the way that we're nationally accounting and assessing policy. And I feel that's a major gap. And that's clearly something which is national modelling can't do. It operates at 106 sectors and simply doesn't have that level of disaggregation that we would need to understand thousands and thousands of products. So therefore, this lack of connection between national accounting and government reporting makes it very difficult for us to say, when a company makes a change, how does that, or if companies make a number of changes, how do those collectively add up to contribute to our overall targets, be it greenhouse gas emissions, resource efficiency, or other environmental goals. And so therefore, one of the big challenges I think we need to address is how we can develop a consistent and coherent national modelling system, which has started to develop, but one that's consistent with sectors, companies and products to help inform decision making at all levels. And that's why I think that not one modelling approach could ever provide the answer, but is bringing together the strength of a range of approaches, the specificity of individual analysis happening in companies, but the need to add those collectively up to understand how businesses can change and how they can contribute to a range of social goods. So I will leave it there for questions, and yes, thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, John. Really fantastic to see the work that you've already done and what the challenges are that are still facing us. So we've had quite a few questions. We've got time to take a couple. So Katie Lamb asks, are we able to access the data that's that you've used behind these diagrams?
Yes, we provide it to DEFRA, who put a massive spreadsheet on their website with most of this being available. And if that's not available, then we respond as quickly as we can. We're pretty much as open source as we possibly can be, but that doesn't mean we've managed to be able to provide everything fully open yet, but there is a willingness to, and we will provide that data for anyone who wants it.
Brilliant, thanks John, that would be really useful. And Matt Winning asks, are the 2050 numbers based on current technological production methods, or are these updated, and if so, how?
Yes, so these are updated, and they are based on a number of assumptions. So we've used often econometric approaches to understand how these may change in the, over time. So in essence, they look at previous production efficiencies over the last 30 years, but also based on individual assessments of sectors of what might be possible. So I think, for example, it would be unless we're going to make, let's say, a fundamental shift in steel away from blast furnaces, we're unlikely to see production efficiencies within that technology increase substantially. So we have tried to recognise those limits within them. One thing I would add is that we never claim a projection. We always claim a scenario. It's a simulation of the future based on a range of outcomes, and being upfront and transparent and being able for others to be able to question those assumptions, in essence, is really, really important, I think.
Great, thanks, John. And actually, the next question is linked to those assumptions. So Zafia asked what consumption patterns or pattern assumptions were taken into consideration at the point of building the graph, other than where the impact will land. We had
well, in the one I showed, I think we generated over 70 different scenarios for DEFRA on that one. And when it's around that, so we had different scenarios with different consumption projections. Based on different levels of final demand output in the future, some with higher levels of economic growth in the UK, some with considerably lower levels of growth. One scenario actually sort of was based more on the notion that we may not have much growth at all in the future. And while that might not sound attractive to lots of people, it's not too dissimilar from the situation that we've had over about the last 12 years. We've had very limited growth overall. We also then can take into account, and we did in some of the scenarios, what we might call production structure changes, which is so not just a change in the overall output, but also the, I suppose, the recipe of industry based on different consumption patterns in the future.
Great, thanks, John. And then I think we've got time for a couple more. I think, Mike, I'm not sure if it's a question or more of an observation, but it's quite interesting. So Mike says it's interesting to note that the UK-based emissions and resource consumption can be focused towards the basics of Maslow's hierarchy, but as you move up, so the imported emissions and exported impacts increase.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So we've done some work on distribution analysis as well around this, and I think what we find is that the areas of emissions which happen inside the UK often relate to what might be described as basic services are wrong, but essential life services, nutrition, the heating of the home, local mobility, and so on. And then it is the it's the products at the more luxury end which are often imported. So in reality, it is often the higher income groups that have a greater reliance on imported emissions as a proportion of their total impact in comparison to lower income groups. And in reality, what that means is if we target just territorial emissions, we in essence could have quite a regressive output in comparison to the free ride which potentially imported emissions can get. Now, it's slightly more complicated than that from individual products, but that as a generalization, I think that stands up.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and particularly within the context of the NICE programme and the 5 centres that are obviously looking at different resource flows and associated with products. It'd be interesting to map that out. And Anthony asks about the possible link with the proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism and the consultation that's currently ongoing.
Yes, I realise I've got to respond to that. It's on my to-do list to respond to that consultation because I've written quite widely on border carbon adjustments. So I could probably run a whole seminar on just the border carbon adjustment. So I'll try and make this a really brief answer and happy to follow up with someone. I am generally not in favour of them for a number of key reasons. Not only are they incredibly complex to put in place, but we have to remember that they're an adjustment. So therefore, we have to differentiate between the carbon price within the country and from the country that we're importing in. And the global supply chains that we need to understand and the complexity to do that is really challenging. Like lots of the steel that enters our country doesn't just come in as steel, it comes embodied in thousands and thousands of products. And capturing that, I think, is extremely difficult. And what I'm really worried about is that in reality, if we're going to take climate crisis seriously, we need to have such a substantial reduction in the next 10 years that I'm worried it potentially can be used as a delay mechanism to spend 5-6 years to get some structure in place, when in reality, we can implement a whole range of resource efficiency strategies affecting our consumption, which can have a significant benefit and impact now. I know, again, it's one of those issues which is considerably more complex, and there may be calls for it around particular commodities. But I remain reasonably sceptical that we would be able to implement something which would be effective in the short term.
Thanks, John. I think that would be really interesting to explore that further with others who are interested in that topic. I think we are running out of time. We're just going to go to a break, but we've got one more question if you can provide a quick answer, John. So Tom asks, with the data by materials mapped to sectors, is it possible to map substances or chemicals where their presence level is reliably known?
Okay, so we can only, on the material flow side, we can only disaggregate it around 13 key high-level materials as opposed to individual substances. I've always thought that you could develop a substance level input-output model, but haven't done that. But well, for quite obvious reasons, I think it would be incredibly challenging. But I think there is scope for the disaggregation of key sectors where a very important substance plays a key role, and try and use that to track its flow from production to consumption. So I think it's potentially an interesting and growing research area. Yeah. I noticed, sorry, very quickly, Fiona, I noticed a couple of messages saying how to get hold of all this. I'm happy to signpost people after, but we also recognise that the modelling's got ahead of our ability to make this as widely available as we would like. So that's something which we're exploring about how we can make this more accessible. It's not out of a desire not to show, it's out of the time available to provide something meaningful out there. And I agree that's somewhere we need to improve, but we'll do our best.
Great, thanks, John. And as we've discussed before, we're very happy to support that and joining up kind of the dots, so to speak. Great, thanks ever so much. I feel that discussion could go on for a lot longer, but we are going to go to a very quick break.